Margaret Collins pulled the hood of her navy raincoat tighter around her face, the soft patter of raindrops creating a rhythm against the fabric. The sky hung low over Willowbrook Park, a gentle, silvery gray that seemed to press the world into quiet stillness. At 68, she'd grown used to her own company. Her days were filled with quiet routines, a cup of coffee at 7 a.m., reading the newspaper by the kitchen window, tending to her modest garden in the afternoons. But the rain had driven her indoors for days now, and the cabin fever was beginning to creep in. So, despite the weather, she decided to take her usual afternoon walk. The park had always been her favorite escape. She and her late husband, James, used to stroll these winding paths every Sunday after church. She could still picture him walking ahead, his hand outstretched for hers, smiling under the shade of the oak trees. That memory lived in her chest like a small, warm ember, comforting and painful all at once. Margaret slowed her steps as she neared the old wooden bench near the duck pond. It had been there for decades, its slats worn smooth by time. The rain had left it damp, but she sat anyway, the cold seeping through her coat. Across the pond, the ducks huddled together, their reflections rippling in the rain-dappled water. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the rain fill her senses, willing herself to feel something other than the dull ache of loneliness. That's when she heard it, a faint, distressed yelp. Her eyes opened instantly. A small brown and white dog was darting frantically near the path, its leash trailing in the mud. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, despite the slump in his posture, was a few yards behind, holding his coat over his head as he tried to catch up. Margaret stood, instinct kicking in. "Hey, over here," she called, crouching slightly and extending her hand toward the frightened dog. The animal hesitated, then bounded toward her, tail tucked but eyes wide with relief. She grabbed the leash just as the man reached her side. "Thank you," he panted, pushing his wet hair back from his forehead. She slipped right out of her collar. "Gave me a scare." "It's no trouble," Margaret said, offering the leash back. "She's a sweet little thing. What's her name?" "Daisy," he replied, smiling for the first time. And in that instant, Margaret's breath caught. There was something in the curve of his jaw, the lines around his eyes, something achingly familiar. Her heart gave a stutter. The man's smile faded slightly as he studied her face in return. I'm sorry, but do I know you?" Margaret swallowed, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears. Thomas Miller." His eyes widened. For a moment, the rain and the years seemed to vanish. "Margaret Collins. My God, it's been 45 years," she finished softly. They stood there, the rain falling around them, each suspended in a strange, fragile moment where the past and present seemed to blur. Daisy gave a small shake, sending droplets flying, and it broke the spell just enough for Thomas to speak. I live just a few blocks from here," he said. "Would you maybe like to get a cup of coffee? I think we have a lot to talk about." Margaret hesitated, her mind racing with memories she thought she'd buried. But something, maybe the way his voice still carried a hint of that boyish warmth, made her nod. "Yes," she said, almost surprising herself. "I think we do." They began walking toward the park exit, side by side, the rain following them like a curtain drawing back on the second act of a story neither had expected to continue. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped into the cozy warmth of Willow's Corner Cafe. The scent of fresh coffee beans and baked goods wrapped around Margaret like an old quilt. She pulled down her hood and brushed raindrops from her hair, glancing at Thomas as he did the same. He looked older, of course, his once dark hair now silver, a few deeper lines marking his face. But there was still a sturdiness about him, the same steady presence she had once leaned on during summer nights under the stars. They found a table by the window, where raindrops streamed down the glass like tiny rivers. Thomas ordered 2 coffees, black, without asking, and she noticed. "You remembered," she said softly. His lips curved into a faint smile. "Some things you don't forget." Silence settled between them for a moment, filled with the clink of cups and the murmur of other patrons. Margaret wrapped her hands around her mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "I thought you'd gone to California," she said finally. "I did," he replied. "Back in '78. I had a job offer in construction management. It was supposed to be temporary, but life has a way of keeping you where you don't expect to stay." Margaret studied him, trying to piece together the decades between then and now. "You never wrote. You never called." Thomas sighed, his gaze fixed on the coffee in his hands. "I tried once. A letter. But then, I heard you'd gotten engaged to James." She blinked. "I wasn't engaged when you left. I didn't even meet James until 2 years later." A shadow crossed his face. "Guess the rumor mill did its job. I figured you moved on, so I stayed away. I didn't want to interfere." Margaret felt a mix of frustration and sadness. All those years of wondering why he had disappeared, and it had been a misunderstanding. "James was a good man," she said quietly. "I loved him, but that doesn't mean I forgot you." His eyes met hers then, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that they'd both carried the same ghost for decades. When they left the cafe, the rain had softened to a mist. Daisy trotted happily at Thomas's side, occasionally glancing back at Margaret as if sensing her presence was important. "I live just a few streets over," he said, gesturing toward a row of brick houses. "You, Elm Street," she replied, "by the church." "That's not far," he said with a faint smile. "Seems we've been neighbors for a while without knowing it." The thought made her uneasy. How many times had she walked past these streets without realizing the person she once loved lived so close? They reached his front gate, a small, white picket fence with a rose bush leaning lazily over the side. "Would you like to come in?" "Just for a few minutes," he asked. "It's nothing fancy, but—" She hesitated only a moment before nodding. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the faint scent of cedar and fresh-baked bread. Photographs lined the mantel, but none of a wife or children. She noticed. "Never married?" she asked. He shook his head. "A couple of close calls. But I think my heart was always somewhere else." Her breath caught, and she looked away, pretending to admire a framed landscape painting on the wall. They sat in his living room, mugs of tea replacing the coffee. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound for a while. "I always thought I'd run into you someday," Margaret admitted. "But as the years passed, I stopped expecting it." "Same here," Thomas said. "I guess fate was waiting for the right rainy day." She smiled faintly, but the smile faded as she thought of James. "Part of me feels guilty," she said. "Talking to you like this, it's stirring up things I haven't felt in a long time." "James is part of your story," Thomas said gently. "But so am I, and maybe that's okay." In the days after their unexpected reunion, Margaret found herself walking to the park more often. Sometimes Thomas was there, sometimes he wasn't. But when he was, they always ended up talking about music they used to love, the places they'd dreamed of visiting, the small details of their everyday lives now. Daisy grew fond of her, often leaning against Margaret's legs as they chatted. One afternoon, Thomas invited her to join him for a Sunday lunch. She accepted, feeling a flutter of anticipation she hadn't felt in decades. The meal was simple: roasted chicken, fresh bread, a bottle of wine. They laughed about old stories from high school, but eventually, Thomas's expression grew serious. "There's something I need to tell you," he began. "The real reason I left wasn't just a job. My father had debts, bad ones. People were threatening the family. Leaving was the only way I knew to protect everyone." Margaret sat quietly, absorbing the words. It wasn't abandonment. It had been sacrifice. "I wish you told me," she said softly. "I was 22 and stupid," he admitted. "But I never stopped thinking about you." As autumn deepened, Margaret realized how much Thomas had become part of her days again. They didn't talk about the future at first. It was enough to enjoy the present. But one evening, walking back from the park, Thomas stopped under a street lamp and turned to her. "I don't want to waste any more years," he said. "Would you consider letting me be part of your life again, for as long as we have?" Her eyes stung with unshed tears. She thought of all they'd lost, and all they could still have. "Yes," she whispered. I would. Winter arrived with soft snow over Willowbrook Park. Margaret and Thomas walked together, Daisy bounding ahead, their hands intertwined. There was no need to rush, no fear of missed opportunities. They had already lost decades, and now each moment was precious. The rainy afternoon that had brought them back together had been pure chance. But what they chose to do with that chance was theirs alone. And as Margaret looked at Thomas, she realized that love, like the rain, could return when you least expected it. And sometimes, it was even more beautiful the second time around. The first heavy snow of the season had fallen overnight, covering Willowbrook in a thick white blanket. Margaret pulled on her wool coat and boots, feeling that familiar pull toward the park. She hadn't heard from Thomas in 3 days, and though there was no agreement between them to see each other daily, she felt his absence keenly. When she arrived, she spotted Daisy's paw prints in the snow near the pond, fresh ones, no more than an hour old. Following them, she found Thomas sitting alone on their usual bench, his gloved hands clasped between his knees. You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, she said gently. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just thinking about how fast time seems to be slipping away these days. Margaret sat beside him, the cold would seeping through her coat. We can't stop the clock, Thomas, but we can choose what we do with the time we have. He was quiet for a long moment before turning to her. Margaret, I have a medical appointment next week, just to check up, but I've been putting it off. There's something in my gut telling me I can't anymore. Her heart clenched. You should have told me sooner. I didn't want to worry you, he said, but I guess I'm realizing that maybe I want someone to worry about me again. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat in her small living room, the ticking clock filling the silence. Her mind wandered back to a summer evening in 1977, the last summer before Thomas left. They'd been at the county fair, the air thick with the scent of fried dough and the sound of distant laughter. Thomas had won her a small stuffed bear at the ring toss, and she remembered the way his hand lingered on hers when he gave it to her. You're my forever, he'd whispered in her ear that night. She had believed it without question. And now, decades later, she wondered if maybe, despite everything, it was still true. A week later, the phone rang. It's benign, Thomas said without preamble. She could hear the relief in his voice. The doctor says I'm fine. Margaret felt her own tension melt away. I'm glad, she said softly. You scared me. Then maybe you understand how I felt all those years, he replied gently, not knowing where you were, if you were happy. There was a pause. Can I see you tonight? He asked. The town's Christmas market was in full swing when they met that evening. Strings of golden lights draped from booth to booth, the smell of cinnamon and pine filling the air. Thomas bought her a cup of hot cider, and they wandered among the stalls, talking about everything from holiday traditions to the best pie recipes. At one booth, a vendor sold hand-carved wooden ornaments. Thomas picked up one shaped like a small heart and handed it to her. For your tree, he said. She smiled, feeling an ache of something both old and new in her chest. But as the weeks passed, Margaret began to sense something shifting. Thomas seemed distracted at times, distant. One afternoon, while walking Daisy, he mentioned he might take a trip back to California to visit old friends. I'd only be gone a few weeks, he said. Margaret's heart sank. And after that? He hesitated. I don't know. Maybe I'd stay longer. Maybe. I need to see if that part of my life has anything left for me. It felt like a sharp winter wind cutting through her coat. We just found each other again, Thomas. I know, he said quietly. That's what makes it so hard. 2 days later, Margaret found an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a letter in Thomas's careful handwriting. He wrote about how meeting her again had been a gift he never expected, but also how it had stirred questions in him about the years he'd left behind. He promised he wasn't running away this time, only trying to close chapters that had never been finished. She read the letter 3 times, then set it on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long while. 3 weeks later, on another rainy afternoon, Margaret was sitting on the same bench where they'd first reunited when she saw Daisy bounding toward her. Thomas was a few steps behind, his coat damp, his expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "I came back," he said simply, "because everything I was looking for was already here." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as he sat beside her. "You scared me again," she whispered. "Then I guess we're even," he said with a smile that felt like home. That night, in the quiet of her living room, Thomas took her hand. "I can't promise forever," he said, "but I can promise every day I have left." Margaret squeezed his fingers. "That's all I want." They sat there in comfortable silence, the rain tapping against the windows, knowing that after decades of missed chances, they had finally chosen each other again, and this time they wouldn't let go.